What's the most unreasonable thing a boss ever asked you to lie about? My boss handed me safety inspection papers for our factory press and told me to backdate them because corporate was visiting tomorrow and the machine kept breaking down during shifts. My hands started shaking as I told him I couldn't sign papers saying broken equipment was safe. He smiled like it was nothing and said, "Everyone does this. Sign them or you're fired." I asked what happens if someone gets hurt and he leaned forward. "Nobody's getting hurt. Corporate just needs paperwork." I stared at those papers thinking about the 20 guys using that press every single day. The thing had been jamming and making this horrible grinding sound all week. He stood up so fast, his chair rolled back and got in my face. "You have 2 kids at home, right? Wife just had surgery?" My heart started pounding. He told me I'd be blacklisted from every factory in the state if I walked out without signing. My brain was screaming that we desperately needed this money for my daughter's medicine and my wife's bills, but I kept seeing that press jamming with someone's hands trapped inside. He slammed his hand on the desk and said, "Last chance, sign or get out." Other managers walked past his office window, but every single one looked away, and I knew nobody was going to help me. I was shaking when I pushed the papers back and said, "Find someone else." His face turned red and he jabbed his finger at the door. "Get out, you're done." I grabbed my toolbox and walked out in a daze. My friend from second shift caught me on the floor and his face went white when I told him what happened. He grabbed my arm and promised he'd try to warn people about the press. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes trying to process everything before I could even start driving. My wife took one look at my face when I walked in and knew something was wrong. I told her I got fired for refusing to lie about safety equipment, and she grabbed my face hard. "You did the right thing," but I could see the terror in her eyes and hear the shake in her voice. That night I kept thinking about that broken press and all those guys who'd be using it tomorrow when corporate showed up. I tried calling the plant hotline to report it, but got sent to voicemail. My friend texted me at midnight saying he'd warned everyone he could, but the morning shift was still scheduled. I barely slept, knowing that press would be running in a few hours. My phone rang at 6 a.m. the next morning, and my friend from the factory was screaming so loud I could barely understand him. The press just crushed someone's hand during the corporate tour, and they all watched it happen. I couldn't catch my breath. He said the machine jammed like it had been doing, and the safety guard completely failed because there was no inspection. The injured guy was only 23 years old and had just gotten engaged last month. My friend's voice cracked when he said, "Your boss signed those papers himself yesterday and showed them to corporate when it happened." 3 hours later, I got a call from a lawyer representing the injured guy, and I thought I was in trouble. He said, "Your former boss is facing criminal charges, but you're not because he falsified those documents after you refused." I almost collapsed with relief. Corporate had compared his fake papers to the maintenance records, and everyone at the plant knew I'd been fired for refusing. A week later, I walked into a conference room packed with corporate executives, and my old boss was already sitting there looking like he might throw up. They asked me to explain what happened, and I walked them through everything about how he'd ordered me to backdate inspections, how he'd threatened my family, and how he'd fired me on the spot. The investigator stood up and started laying papers on the table one by one. First, the emails where my boss had bragged to upper management about skipping the inspection to hit production goals and had literally written that safety concerns were overblown. Then, he added maintenance reports, showing the same problems flagged over and over, photos of the mangled press, and medical records documenting 2 completely severed fingers. He pulled out witness statements from 3 different managers who'd seen my boss threaten me through his office window, my friend's documented timeline with timestamps of everything I'd told him, and my call logs proving I'd tried to warn people immediately after getting fired. Finally, he placed my boss's signature on the falsified inspection papers dated the day I was fired. The entire room went dead silent. I stared at my former boss and said, "You threatened my children because I wouldn't help you lie, and that guy lost 2 fingers because you signed those papers anyway." He wouldn't even lift his head to look at me. One executive announced that criminal charges had been filed that morning and his employment was terminated immediately, then added that security was waiting outside to escort him out. I watched his face completely crumble. 3 months later, the judge sentenced him to 14 months in prison, and he's permanently banned from manufacturing. I started as supervisor last week.